So, next up is Jonathan Glover, who works on medical law and ethics at King's College London and at the Centre for Practical Ethics in Oxford. Jonathan's book, Humanity, A Moral History of the 20th Century, we cited quite a bit in the last meeting, Enlightenment 2.0, and he thinks it as rather a dark book, but I think you should try and still have a look at it. Illuminating, yes, the darkness.
A candle, perhaps. Or what was the other thing? A mess of candle grease you said we might be in danger of producing.
Whirling wax. Jonathan Glover.
Right. First, thank you, Roger, for inviting me to this very stimulating meeting. I am going to talk about, I don't know why. I mean, I'm actually quite a cheerful, optimistic person, but I find myself often gravitating towards thinking about things that many people describe as evil. And what I want to do today is talk a bit about a project I've been engaged in, a project which you will see is somewhat lacking in scientific rigor, so I slightly diffidently present it in this audience. But let me tell you about the book that Roger mentioned was a book about 20th century atrocities. And I was interested in, when I went to see Auschwitz, I had the thought that so many other people have. You get overwhelmed by the thought, how was it possible for people to do this to each other, to do this to other people? And it seems a kind of challenge to our very idea that human beings are quite moral beings. Obviously, there's a boring platitudinous truth, perhaps not boring, but a platitudinous truth that we are both moral beings and beings capable of horrendous atrocities. But I was interested in what it is about human psychology that makes it possible. So the way I approached this was to try and think out, slightly in the spirit of some of the talks we've just heard, to try and think out what sorts of things prevent people in ordinary life most of the time from doing terrible things to each other. Why is it that I come into this room feeling quite relaxed and cheerful, not expecting any of you to get up and knife me or attack me or steal my things or whatever it is? And I just took three major, obviously self-interest is part of it. It's obviously right that culture is organized in such a way as to try and stamp on the free rider problem and to give people incentives, to self-interested incentives, to not to do harm to other people. But of course, as we all know, in the Chinese Cultural Revolution or in Nazi Germany or in many other places, the incentives worked the other way. The person who sheltered a Jew in Nazi-occupied Poland was threatened with death all over the place. The person who helped a reactionary in the Chinese Cultural Revolution was ostracized, humiliated, and so on. So, leaving aside self-interest, which obviously a lot of the time is important, do we have other resources, what I call the moral resources, which might operate where self-interest doesn't, to restrain people from doing terrible things to each other? And I came up with three. I don't mean this to be an exhaustive list. I think the list that Jonathan gave is longer and rightly longer. But I talked a bit about sympathy and what went wrong in these terrible atrocities. What happened to sympathy? Well, there are lots of answers, but part of the story is that sympathy was anesthetized by other groups being dehumanized. The way the Nazis, for instance, showed films of Jews intercut with pictures of rushing hordes of rats, the anti-Semitic cartoons of Dashdoma, and so on. Sympathy can be anesthetized in that sort of way. It's also, there's perhaps in a way more deeply disturbing phenomenon that Philip Zimbardo's famous study brings out, where even without there being any basis for difference of ethnicity, difference of religion, difference of political ideology, randomly assigned among students to different groups. They knew they were randomly assigned, and yet they started to develop tribal hostility and treated each other cruelly. The second moral resource I talked about was respect for dignity. Most of us, most of the time, are affronted. If somebody is begging for money, it's a bit mean if somebody says no. But we are outraged if someone spits on the beggar. An insult to someone's dignity normally outrages us. It's one of the great powerful inhibitors, I believe, against atrocities. And for instance, there was an interview with Franz Stangl, the commandant of the Nazi extermination camp of Treblinka. And Gita Sereni, the journalist, asked him many years after the war, given that you were going to kill them all, what was the point of all the cruelty, all the humiliation? And he replied, in order to make it possible for the people who had to do what they did, in other words, to remove the inhibition by trampling on their dignity first. Then the third one I talked about was the sense of moral identity. I don't want to be the sort of person who perpetrates some atrocity as a mass murderer or a torturer. But again, that can be drastically reduced as a moral restraint by, for instance, the fragmentation of responsibility that comes from the complexity of modern society. I am just the person who's driving the train which is taking people to some extermination camp. I am just the person who's supplying a crematorium, and I don't ask too many questions about what it's for and so on. Well, I took those three moral resources, and I thought that it would be interesting, having, as you applied them to 20th century atrocities, I thought it would be interesting to look at other cases where people carry out appalling acts and to ask what went wrong in their psychology. And because I'm interested in psychiatry, one obvious area was psychopathy and antisocial personality disorder. Psychopathy being, there's a thing called the Hare psychopathy checklist, and if you score very high on it, you're a psychopath. You're also within antisocial personality disorder, but if you score fairly high but not quite so high, you're within antisocial personality disorder but not a psychopath. And my project was, I've always been fascinated by these groups of people, both groups, the psychopaths and the rest of antisocial personality disorder, because what people often say about them is that they lack a conscience. And because I've been teaching ethics for many years, that raises for me more questions than it actually answers. What does it mean to say that they lack a conscience? And so I thought it would be interesting to go and talk to a group of people, one by one, interview them to find out how they thought, if at all, about right and wrong. So there's a psychiatric hospital, which is a kind of criminal psychiatric hospital in Britain called Broadmoor, where you only get in if you've both committed some pretty horrendous crime, murder, rape, some horrendous act of violence, and you've also got some kind of psychiatric diagnosis. They make a big deal about it being a hospital, not a prison, but when I go for my interview appointment, I have to check at the nurse in each, the ward the person I'm going to interview is in. I check in with the nurse, and the nurse isn't the sort of person I used to fantasize about at the age of 18. The nurse is a sort of brisk young man in a black uniform whose trade union is the Prison Officers Association. Anyway, I wanted to go in and ask them about right and wrong. Now, it seemed to me that I would get nowhere if I went in saying, people say your diagnosis means you lack a conscience, do you? So I tried to devise less threatening ways of exploring how they did or didn't think about morality. So I would ask them, for instance, whether they had children. If they did, what would they teach? What would they ideally like to teach their child about right and wrong? If they didn't have children, supposing they did. Or I would offer them Plato's, they didn't tell them it was Plato's, but Plato's brilliant thought experiment, the ring of Gyges, where you have a ring that makes you invisible. So that removes most of the self-interested, I'll get caught thoughts, which often deter us from antisocial behavior of one sort or another. What would you do then? What would you feel it was okay to do and what wasn't? And then I'd also ask them, do you drive? Did you drive before you got into this hospital? Did you drive to the supermarket? Would you park in the disabled space? And if they said no, there's all sorts of interesting possibilities. You can explore a lot about people's morality by this, I think, but it's a rather simple question. I mean, there are a number of reasons for not parking in the disabled space. Some of them moral and some of them less admirable. I think I have just about all of them, including the less admirable ones. Starting at the bottom, I don't want to get wheel clamped. That's nothing really to do with morality, that's pure self-interest. Second reason why in the local supermarket I don't park in the disabled space is that one of the slightly embarrassing things about my job is I have the title Professor of Ethics. And if the neighbours saw me, it would be kind of embarrassing. But then, of course, there are other better reasons that I hope most of us have. We feel sympathy for the disabled person having to lug groceries further just because I've taken the space. There's the thought disabled people have a right to it and I don't. There's the thought, the moral identity thought. I don't want to be the sort of person who's so mean as to save myself 2 or 3 minutes finding another space at the cost of what the disabled person is entitled to. Now, I found in talking to them that there were obvious variations. I mean, one obvious question is whether the antisocial personality disorder, whether the group is really a coherent, unified group, whether it isn't sometimes used as a kind of waste bin for people who don't fit into other psychiatric categories and are rather a nuisance in one way or another. But I did find certain common patterns, not universal patterns, but common patterns in the interviews. One was a certain kind of shallowness in their thinking about morality. For instance, what things are wrong, I asked, and one person said, this is to what you tell your children were wrong. They shouldn't swear, you know. Do what your mother tells you to do, you know. Do well at school when you grow up, you know. Be careful who you mix with. Don't talk to strangers, things like that. And then I would say to one of them who'd mentioned bullying and swearing, which is more wrong, bullying or swearing? Swearing and bullying is wrong, both wrong in my eyes. Both the same, I asked? Yeah, both the same. Another one says, but I've set myself a pretty high moralistic standard. And I say, what can you say about your very high moralistic standard? Well, I don't swear in front of females. I'm respectful. I mean, I believe in opening doors, and if a female is walking along, be it a patient or a member of staff, I let them go through the door first, and things like that. Now, I think there's a kind of shallowness and triviality in making that kind of thing the things you mention when you're saying what you teach your children. Another aspect of it, and this possibly hooks up with some of the thoughts people have been having about religion in this context, but I'm struck that very often they seem to go by a kind of command morality. For instance, one of them I asked, why do you say swearing is wrong? The answer was, well, it's just the way I was brought up, not swearing at people. It's the way my mum and dad brought me up, you know. We were brought up as to what was wrong and what was right, and that, you know. And that went with this particular person when asked, a lot of them turned out to believe in capital punishment and had rather retributive moral views. And I would say, what's the justification for capital punishment? And they'd say, oh, well, it shouldn't be applied for lots of crimes, just a few. Well, which ones? And I was expecting murder. But actually this person said damage to the Queen's property. And one of the weird things about Britain is that anything that's public property is often described as the Queen's property. So I said, well, supposing I, went and stamped on one of the waste paper baskets in this hospital, I'm damaging the Queen's property. Do you really think I ought to be hanged? He said, no, I don't mean that. I mean damaging Buckingham Palace, Balmoral, places like that the Queen owns. I mean, there's a kind of strange deference to authority which goes with this. And this retributive thing. What I was struck by was that there is a morality there. It isn't that this is just total amoralism and no moral concepts, but that it's a morality which, as far as I can see, is not rooted in sympathy at all. It's rules about letting the woman go through the door first. It's not swearing. It's not damaging the Queen's property. It's doing what your mum said, and so on. It's simply not rooted in sympathy, but in some other basis. Now, what I found, I told them when I went in, I'm not asking you about your crime. I haven't come to talk about that. I don't want to know why you're in here. But nonetheless, they often wanted to tell me. And the other thing they often wanted to tell me about was their childhoods. And one of the things which they often said, and I'm acutely aware of the methodological problem that this group is a group many people think are pathological liars, I, on the whole, tended to believe what they said to me in these interviews, not always, but on the whole I did, that I should quote against this my wife's opinion that I am always a total sucker for con men. This is something which possibly casts a shadow over the things I say in this talk. But nonetheless, what they said was that they'd had appalling childhoods. They described sometimes sexual abuse, sometimes emotional rejection, sometimes humiliation, sometimes at home, sometimes in what in Britain is called being in care in the public authority, because they're taken away from their family. And I found that the psychiatrists in Broadmoor, who I talked to and was working with, they, who are not, I believe, known as pathological liars, they said that they believed that about 85% of the people in Broadmoor did have horror stories of one kind or another about their childhoods, and that they, not just stories, but that they actually were true. Now, I hadn't gone in with the idea of thinking about the causes. I really went in with a descriptive project of thinking about what their morality was. But I found myself, as they talked more and more about their childhood and its impact on their lives, I got more and more to get an intuitive sense of what seemed to me a possible causal story linking the childhood with the way they turned out. Now, I'm acutely aware that what I'm talking to mainly a group of scientists today, this is not science. This is what's cheerfully called qualitative research. Sometimes gloomily, I think, the only the distinguishing feature of qualitative research is that it doesn't have statistics. And I'm sufficiently impressed by science to not regard not having statistics as a virtue. But the way I see it, I would want to defend this kind of research, but as I say, it's not properly scientific. I think we can learn a lot from individual cases by attentive listening. You know, for instance, I think historians learn a lot by reading, say, Gilas's account of what it was like to spend the evening with Stalin, or reading Hitler's table talk. You know, I think it would be ludicrous to dismiss that because there aren't control groups and statistics. So I think of myself in this project as trying to get some intuitive feel for it, but with the idea that it's hypothesis generating for some possibly more rigorous study to be carried out by someone else. Now, one of the things which they described often in their account of their terrible childhood was the anger they felt. One of them, for instance, said to me, "And so I wasn't shown no affection, and it actually got to me because the first day I was taken to school by my mother, and then after that she actually left me to come home. And I couldn't understand why all the other parents were coming and picking their kids up. Why don't I get picked up? That's what I must have felt, because on one occasion I smashed all the milk bottles to draw attention from other people." And a similar need possibly lay behind anger they showed in later life. I asked at some point a question about something he'd said he was doing. "Did you have a kind of anger you were getting out?" And he replied, "Yeah." And I say, "Why were you angry?" "Because I felt ignored, I felt lonely." Another one said, "I didn't used to feel guilty because I had too much hate inside me to feel guilty against anyone." "Against everyone?" I asked. against everyone. I ask, even people who haven't done anything? Even people who haven't done anything to me. Why do you think that was? Because they had what I wanted and I didn't have it, and I was feeling angry because they had it. There's another one who he told me he'd done a rape. And as he described his feelings at the time, he said, I was driving up towards my parents' place because I was going to kill them. And that's where my head was. I was just going to wipe them out altogether. I thought the anger might go away then. I asked, did you care in those days about hurting people or not really? Oh yeah, I cared, yeah. It used to hurt me very much myself when I had a nice relationship going and it split up. And then he goes on to link the failures in his relationship to what he saw as the intrusive voice of his mother when things went wrong. It would be her, you know, my mother. She'd be in your mind, I asked? She'd be in my head, saying I was rotten, I should kill myself, I don't deserve to live, and all the rest of it, and that sort of stuff. And then I say, when you don't have to answer any questions if you don't want to, but when you raped a person, was that anger or was it? And he replies, it was anger. It was anger against my mother and my brother in my head that night. So the first route from humiliation and deprivation in childhood, which I'm hypothesizing, is that it makes people very angry, and anger is a plausible link, obviously, to violence. But then it also, the way they were treated in children, also, as they described it, seemed to me to create a great hunger for recognition. They talked a lot about how they wanted, they didn't use this jargon, but peer group approval and recognition, and that often being violent and aggressive was a way of getting that. One of them said, I was living, you could say, extremely in the fast lane, very fast. I felt people were looking up to me. Things were done to me like initiation into teddy boys. Meant you had to have your legs cut, and things happened with knives and stuff like that. But to me it was bravado. It was like badges of honor. And I ask, you're saying you wanted respect, is that right? Not so much respect. I wanted recognition. Yeah, I suppose I felt, thinking about it, I felt I was a nobody, but being with these people I was a somebody. And it seems to me that it's plausible that this need for recognition meant that they tried to get the recognition in a way that they found easy as physically powerful young men of violent acts towards other people. Also, their sympathy, the growth of their sympathy was obviously very stunted. One of the things I was interested in, because the 1950s psychiatrist Cleckley, who wrote a classic, though rather dotty in my view, book about psychopaths, Cleckley talks at times as though there's something missing from birth. Something missing from birth. They just somehow don't have the capacity for sympathy. But I got the impression, talking to these, I'd often ask them, when you did what you did you feel sympathy? And then as a follow-up question, if you didn't feel sympathy, could you have felt sympathy? And they replied sometimes in terms of building a defensive wall because of fear of either ridicule or rejection. And that defensive wall involved not having sympathy for other people. One of them, for instance, says, ridicule comes into it as well. I got a lot of ridicule when I was a kid. How it's possible, I just don't know, but I turned from an extremely quiet, placid, frightened person to an extremely violent person, you know. I ask, was that linked to the ridicule? Was it escaping from ridicule? Yeah, because after I got attacked, I thought, that's it. I ask, so really it was a kind of defense? Oh yeah, having been ridiculed and not being loved, that's right, you build up this defensive wall and you don't let no one into it. And another one described putting on blinkers, as he put it, that yes, I could sympathize with them, but why the hell should I? Nobody had ever sympathized with me. And I put on blinkers as a result. And one of them said, I wouldn't allow myself to care 10 years ago. So I ask, when you say you wouldn't allow yourself, you knew what it was like if they were hurt, you knew what they felt like, but you wouldn't let yourself bother about it. Yeah, I'd dismiss it. I'd preoccupy myself with something else. Why do you think you turned away from focusing on that? Well, because of the pain, or a type of pain. It's like an emotional duress. That's actually one of the moments when I felt slight worry that I might be hearing the voice of the therapist in Broadmoor rather than the person himself. Finally, I've got to stop in a couple of minutes, but I want to just say something briefly about the idea of moral identity. I mentioned in the talk about 20th century atrocities that one of the things that often holds people back from bad behaviour towards other people is, I don't want to be that kind of person, the sort of person who tortures people, or the sort of person who's so mean as to take the disabled person's space. I remember talking to my collaborator, the psychiatrist Gwen Adshead, who did a lot of this work. She and I did it together. She did one lot of interviews of a different kind, and I did these interviews I'm quoting to you. And I said to her, do you think one of the problems with them is that they don't think other people are very real? Other people don't seem very real to them. And she replied with something I found really puzzling, but I think I've grown to understand it. She said, yes, that is right, and I think also they're not very real to themselves. And at first I was really puzzled by that. What can it mean not to be very real to yourself? But I think what she means is that they have a very weak sense of their own identity. I mean, I would ask them, what sort of person do you think you are? What sort of person would you like to be? Are there any values that shape the pictures? Sometimes I get trivial answers. You know, they mentioned the Kray brothers, famous gangsters. I'd like to be the Kray brothers. Or there's well, I won't insult this entertainer, not a person I'm enthusiastic about. There's a British television entertainer called Bruce Forsyth. I'd say, what sort of person would you like to be? You know, wondering if they were going to say honest, kind, generous. And they said, one of them would say, I'd like to be like Bruce Forsyth, this television entertainer. Sometimes the things were trivial, but I did have the sense that they didn't have much sense of exactly what they were like, or a set of values shaping the image of what they ideally would like to be like. And I had the sense as I talked to them, what came to me was a sense that the sense of our own worth and identity that we develop in childhood and later probably is probably linked to the respect we give to other people. It's kind of a reciprocal interaction. If we won't learn to respect other people unless other people respect us, we're part of this social reciprocal system. I must stop now. Sorry, I've run slightly over time.